Willkommen zurück an alle. Wir hoffen, ihr hattet einen guten Austausch und dürfen jetzt zum nächsten Highlight schreiten. Nach dem Alpenbogenflug geht es an die Keynote und wir haben uns überlegt, wen würden wir denn da gerne hören? Also nicht zunächst die Person, sondern was würden wir gerne hören? Und vorgeschwebt ist uns ein Beitrag, der fachlich wirklich gut fundiert ist, der aber Relevanz hat für den Alpenraum und am allerliebsten ganz unmittelbare Relevanz und im besten Fall auch noch eine neue Perspektive auf das ganze Thema wirft. Das waren unsere Suchkriterien. Wir haben gesucht und siehe da, wir sind fündig geworden und freuen uns jetzt sehr auf Professor Dr. Severin Irl. Hallo Severin.
Hallo.
Bitte an alle auch wieder die Info-Ansicht gerne auf Sprecher stellen. Für die, die jetzt keine Sprecheransicht mehr haben, manchmal stellen sich Dinge auch um im Rahmen dieser Breakout-Sessions, also gerne wieder Sprecheransicht. Hallo Severin. So, ich darf Herrn Dr. Irl vorstellen. Er ist Professor für Biogeographie und Biodiversität an der Goethe-Universität in Frankfurt am Main, ganz konkret dort am Institut für physische Geographie. Und der erforscht ganz spannende Dinge, der Herr Professor Irl, nämlich er beschäftigt sich wissenschaftlich mit der Ausdehnung von Leben in Raum und Zeit und nutzt insbesondere Inseln als lebende Labore, um dort zu erforschen, wie Biodiversität entsteht und wer bzw. was sie gefährdet. So in etwa zumindest. Etwas detaillierter und konkreter wird er uns das selber erzählen. Severin, ganz kurz, Frage an dich. Du hast uns geschrieben in der Abstimmung, dass du sehr leidest aktuell.
Ja, also ich war schon seit 2 Jahren nicht mehr auf einer Insel und es ist kaum auszuhalten. Also.
Okay, genau. Also Corona ist auch für Inselfans eine schwierige Zeit. Wir haben das Glück, dass du deswegen heute bei uns bist und hast aber das Thema der Insel in deinen Vortrag gepackt. Dein Vortrag wird nämlich lauten Treasure Island in Peril, Insights from Oceanic Islands and their relevance for the Alps and other mountain systems. Und mir bleibt jetzt nur noch Ihnen allen viel Spaß und gute Unterhaltung auch zu wünschen und viele Erkenntnisse. Bitte auch gerne wieder mitnotieren. Was sagt es mir für mein Tun rund um den Wildbienenschutz und was kann ich da mitnehmen aus dem Vortrag von Herrn Dr. Irl. Severin, du teilst deinen Bildschirm mit uns. Genau. Und dann würde ich sagen, es kann losgehen. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the nice introduction. I'll switch to English now. I'm very happy to be here and to be part of this interesting project and conference here. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm a biogeographer, and as you already said, as a biogeographer, I study the distribution of living beings in space and time, and I use islands as model systems to do this, but their relevance or the things we find on islands often can be transferred also to other larger systems on the continent. But islands are good living laboratories, as you said, to study the general processes that we find in nature on Earth. So, but the first question is actually, what is an island? And of course, we all maybe have in our mind some kind of tropical dream island like this one with white sandy beaches, coconut trees, tropical lush green tropical rainforest, a blue lagoon, maybe a cocktail in one hand and a surfboard in another hand. And these islands exist. For example, here the Moorea Atoll in the South Pacific. But from an ecological and biogeographic perspective, islands can be much more because isolated habitats exist also on the continent. And for example, here, if you look at the satellite image from Kilimanjaro, this is the Kilimanjaro peak and its neighboring peak, Mount Meru in Tanzania. we can see already just from the colors of the imagery that especially the Alpine zone here above 3,000 meters is something like a sky island in a sea of savanna. So we have very different environmental conditions up here in the Alpine zone than we have in the low elevation savanna here. And therefore, mountains are also termed sky islands because many processes, and that's what I'll be showing, many processes that lead to biodiversity are very comparable between islands and mountains. But of course, I mainly work on real islands here, islands like the Hawaiian archipelago here in this satellite image, which is a typical hotspot volcanism island. We have the youngest island here, with Big Island. Volcanism is down here, and a succession of older islands towards the northwest as the continental crust is moving over the hotspot. New islands are being produced on the way. So I'd like to just share some facts about islands in general. Islands are actually quite irrelevant in terms of surface area. They only cover about 6% of the global surface area. Even though there are about 340,000 islands worldwide, countries like Indonesia alone has already like 17,000 islands, of which 6,000 islands are inhabited. The largest island is Greenland. Even though that is debated, it has about 2.1 million square kilometers. Why is this debated? Because actually Greenland is several smaller islands connected by the ice cap. So the next larger real island is New Guinea, just north of Australia. And we have also a very strong range in geological age of islands. Some islands are quite old, like Madagascar is 150 million years old, and other islands are just a few years or decades old, like the island Surtsey off the coast of Iceland, which was born in 1963 due to volcanic activity. Also, islands can range very dramatically in their elevational range. Some atolls are only a few centimeters, maybe 2-3 meters above sea level. Let's say the Maldives, for example, are basically just a few centimeters above sea level. But some islands reach more than 4,000 meters, for example, Hawaii or Taiwan or Borneo, or even New Guinea. The biggest island is also the highest island. Its peak, Mount William, is 4,500 meters high, and even has a glacier ice cap on top, which is quickly melting away, but it has one. Islands also inhabit about 10% of the human population, but interestingly, they harbor also 27% of the languages. So we have a disproportionately high amount of a number of languages on islands, probably due to the isolation, also in cultural sense. And about 25% of the world's nations are island nations. So this could be a force to reckon with in the political arena if islands would choose to do this, but they obviously don't at the moment, at least. And most importantly for my talk is islands harbor 20% of the global biodiversity, but only cover, like I said, 6% of the Earth's land surface area. So we have a disproportionate high contribution of islands to global biodiversity, about 4 times as much biodiversity as expected just from the land area itself. So islands are real hotspots of biodiversity, and the reason why this biodiversity is so high is not because islands themselves are so species rich. Actually, they're quite species poor. Each island itself is quite species poor, but we have many endemic species on islands, which makes each island unique in a sense, because it has unique species that only occur there. But I'd like to talk about this topic endemism a little bit because it's a little difficult and not clear to everyone. At this point in a lecture to students, I would ask them how many species are endemic on Earth. And then they would say something like, oh, I don't know, 100,000 or 1 million or 10,000 or something like that. And of course, this is a trick question because as far as we know, all species are endemic to Earth that occur on Earth. Because so far, at least for some visitors that might come here and there, but so far we haven't found giraffes or beech trees on Mars, or the Mars rover hasn't found any. If the Mars rover that is currently up there would find a giraffe on Mars, then the giraffe wouldn't be endemic to Earth anymore, but would be would have a wider distribution. So an endemism is always it always depends on the reference system, and in this case, the reference system is the Earth, is our Earth, and this is for biogeographic terms not very sensible, not very helpful because it's much too large. If we look down at smaller systems, for example, at the Alps here, I found some nice examples of endemic species in the Alps. The Alps could be our reference system. So these species here, like this one here, Primula leonii, is an endemic species to the maritime Alps, so even a smaller region, and is actually only found in 2 valleys in the maritime Alps. So it's a very local endemic with a very range-restricted distribution, and this is more what we consider endemism. Or another example is here, Saxifraga styriaca, which is an endemic to Styria, as the name already implies. It only occurs in the region of Styria, yeah, it has a very small distribution and only is found in the Niederrhein there. So a very local endemic species too. Even if we look at this a little more, the distribution of endemic species a little more closely, we see that endemic species, and this is for Austria, but this is probably also true for the rest of the Alps, most endemic species occur at like these mid to high elevations between 1,600 and 2,000 meters. So this is about the transition zone between between the subalpine forest and the alpine meadows, and it's obviously some ecologically important region for endemic species. If we go to islands, islands are much more clearer to define the borders. For the Alps or for many other mountain systems, it's quite difficult to define where the Alps actually begin, where's the border, and where do the Alps end. But for islands, it's much clearer. We have the coastline, which differentiates between the habitable area, so the island, and the inhabitable ocean. So we can very clearly say which species occur on these islands, are endemic to these islands, and which species not. And here I'd like to show you some examples from La Palma, the Canary, and the Canary Islands, my most important model island I work on. Just 3 examples with the 3 different colors here and their distribution. We have this orange species here that Echium whitbretii only occurs in the alpine zone of about the tree line on La Palma, and from the same genus, Echium pininana, which has a very different distribution, very different environmental niche, as we say. It only occurs here on the northern to eastern side of the island in the humid Laurel forest area. And then on the west coast, this is a different species, but also island endemic species only occurring in La Palma, Aeonium nobile, only occurring here in the dry western area. So we see that each species has a very unique distribution adapted to very specific environmental conditions, which we term the environmental niche. And what is the reason for the explosive diversification of island species, where we have within a genus many different species inhabiting different parts of the islands or different environmental niches in the island? This what we term adaptive radiation is a process leading to the strong diversification of island lineages, but this also occurs on mountain systems as well. I'm just going to show some examples here from islands because that's what I work on. For example, from the genus Aeonium, which is a classic example of evolution on islands. It's somewhat the Darwin finches of plants on islands. We have on the Canary Islands about 40 to 60 species of Aeonium, depending on how you count subspecies and so on. Here is the phylogenetic tree, and I'm just highlighting the species here that occur in La Palma, and they're from very different sublineages here in their relatedness, just to show you and the different morphological traits that they have. We see some species like Aeonium nobile I showed you before, which has very large rosettes and very large succulent leaves, but also small shrubby species with very small leaves, or this subshrub that or almost tree-like species, Aeonium arboreum, that can reach 3 to 4 meters of height, of growth height. So we have a founding species that colonized the Canary Islands, and from this founding species, new species have evolved into the different habitats of the island, now occupying different environmental niches and having different morphological traits. Now, this is the radiation process, but I'd also like to talk about how endemism is distributed on islands spatially. And an important part is the elevational gradient. And if we look at here, and the elevational gradient also stands for isolation. If we look at this map here of the Canary Islands in the Atlantic Ocean, we can see that the nearest coastal system is only about 100 kilometers away from the nearest island. But if we go to the Alpine system above 2,000 meters, here depicted in this reddish brown color, the nearest Alpine system on the continent in the Anti-Atlas is more than 700 kilometers away. So that means with increasing elevation, we have increasing isolation, which reduces gene flow between populations and therefore might increase speciation and thus the production of endemic species. What we find is, if we look at, this is a very busy graph, I don't want to look at individual graphs here, but what we find is if we look at these graphs here, we have elevation on the x-axis and percentage of endemic species on the y-axis, is that for all these different island systems, we find a general pattern, and that is the increase of the percentage of endemic species with elevation. And we interpret this as an increase of isolation with elevation, which leads to higher diversification and speciation rates. So more endemic species are created due to evolutionary processes in higher elevations than in lower elevations. And this is not only true for islands, this is also true for mountain systems around the world. So this is a very general pattern that was found on islands, but is also transferable to mountain systems. For example, here is an example from a region in the Alps around Chiavenna, where we had botanical inventories to study this. But another aspect about endemism and speciation is climate, and climate, as we know, is non-stationary. It's quite dynamic. It changes through time, and it has long-lasting effects on biodiversity and how biodiversity is generated. I'd like to show you these two graphs. The upper graph shows the sea level change over the last 800,000 years, and the lower graph temperature change over the last 800,000 years. Year 0 is our current situation, and 800 means 800,000 years ago. And what we see, there's lots of wiggling here for the sea level change and also for temperature change, which is quite synchronous. So when we have temperature change, we have sea level change. And of course, for islands, the sea level change is more relevant. We have during the last glacial maximum, the LGM, so it was about 20,000 years ago, the sea level was 120 meters lower than today, which means, of course, that some islands that are now isolated were connected to each other or to the mainland, or were just less isolated from the mainland than they are now. So through time, we have these changes in connectivity and isolation for islands. And the same is true if we look at the temperature change which is more relevant for mountain systems. If we, for example, look at the Alpine system in mountains above the tree line, it has moved up and down, fluctuated up and down the mountains along with these temperature changes that we have seen in the past 800, even millions of years. This temperature record is just not long enough, but it goes back a couple of million years. So also Alpine systems have been more isolated now during the warm phases, and have had more connectivity when they were lower during the cold phases and this has led to fusion and fission of the Alpine systems within the mountain system. So what we see is the temperatures and sea level have dramatically changed throughout the 800,000 years. And the current warm period that we're in the current warm period. If you look at the graph here, the 0 line, so the reference line for our current climate, or more or less current climate, is here. So most of the climate during the last 800,000 years was much colder than the current climate. So we're in a warm period, the so-called interglacial, which is rather the exception than the norm. And that means that most species that are about a couple 100,000 years old, these are the timescales for evolutionary processes, 100,000 to a million years old, they evolved under much cooler ice age conditions that were dominant in the last several millions of years. If we look at this from a distance perspective, from the spatial perspective, I'd like to show you a graph here with the Alps and one with the archipelago of Hawaii. And it shows the spatial distribution here for the Alps of the Alpine system, so the system above the tree line, during different stages here, the glacial stage, the interglacial stage, and also a future stage with 2 degrees temperature increase. And what we see is in the glacial stage, the Alpine system was restricted to the borders of the Alps, only on the peaks in the on the outer part of the Alps were available habitat, while the central parts of the Alps were covered with large ice shields. The current interglacial, we see this also island-like, archipelago-like behavior of the Alpine system, where we have different peaks functioning as island-like structures. And if we look at the future here, 2 degrees increase, we see that the Alpine area of the Alpine system will dramatically decrease in area. Similarly for islands, but where sea level changes were relevant, if we look at the glacial Hawaii, so Hawaii during the last glacial maximum, where sea level was 120 meters lower, we see that there was fission between islands. So like here, Maui and Molokai and Lanai, they fused to become one big island, but now under current conditions, they are separate islands. So there was fusion and fission between islands, and in future conditions, island area will decrease because of sea level rise. So we have these past changes have led to expansion and contraction of suitable habitat, triggering these diversification processes and speciation processes. Under isolated conditions, we have higher speciation rates because of restricted gene flow than under high connectivity conditions. And that's why, very similar, mountains and islands serve as species pumps because of these fluctuating conditions. They're always constantly pumping out new species, I mean, over evolutionary time, of course. And that's why their contribution to global biodiversity is so important. And what we also see is this possible dramatic contraction of suitable habitat for the next century under the current climate change that we see, which is of course an anthropogenic climate change. So I'd like to show you a little bit around my study system, the Canary Islands that I work on, the islands of the Fortunate, as they're called. As we already saw, they're in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of the Sahara, basically. And even though they're off the coast of the Sahara, they're at least some of the islands, the larger islands, are quite green, which is surprising, but this has mainly to do with the oceanic climate and the trade winds. For example, here the coastal scrub, which is mainly made out of succulent scrub species. That's at the lowest elevation. Then above that, we find the thermophilous woodland, for example, with the iconic dragon tree here, which is very iconic for the Canary Islands. And even Alexander von Humboldt was already fascinated by the dragon tree. Then at mid elevations, on the humid side of the islands where the trade winds come in, we find this so-called Paleo endemic laurel forest, which is very lush, green, dark, evergreen forest, very fresh in this sense. But the species are quite old. They used to be much more widespread in Europe during the Miocene, so 5 to 20 million years ago. But then the ice age started to roll in, and the climate deteriorated, and the species were trapped on the islands here where the climate is mild enough for them. Then another very nice system is the Canary pine forest, which is basically made up of just one tree species, Pinus canariensis, which is endemic tree species to the Canary Islands, only found on the Canary Islands, and it has this fluffy feeling to it because it's very long leaves up to 30, very long needles up to 30 centimeter long needles, and it has this very astounding capability to resprout after fire and from epicormic shoots and all above ground organs, even the stem. So after a fire, it's a fire-prone system. Like this picture was taken 1.5 years after a wildfire. It burned the tree completely, and we already see the needles resprouting. And of course, this is a way for the species to outcompete less fire-tolerant species in itself. Then above the tree line, we find the Alpine broom scrub. We see here the Canary Island, the Canary pine tree forest line, about 2,000 meters elevation. And above that, we find this broom scrub with very astounding species like this one, Echionbritpetii. It's a monocarpic species, what we call monocarpic. That means it only produces one inflorescence in its entire lifetime. It pumps all its resources into this inflorescence, and it's a huge inflorescence. It's about 2 meters high, produces many thousands of flowers, but then it dies afterwards. So it only has one shot in its lifetime, and then it dies. So now I'm coming. Those were the nice pictures from the islands. Now we're coming to the sadder part, the threats to island biodiversity, and basically we can and endemic plant species on islands. I work with plants, but many of these threats also are relevant for other taxonomic groups like insects or mammals or birds, for example. Basically, there are three main threats to island endemic plant species: invasive species, habitat destruction and overexploitation of habitat, and also now more increasingly also climate change. I'd like to start with some climate change information here. These are some pictures from La Palma, from the Canary Islands where I work. This is down at the coast, which is actually a dry system, but we do have increasingly these extreme events. For example, these extreme precipitation events where it looks like that water is oozing out of all the pores of the mountain and coming down these ravines. Very exceptional high precipitation event here in 2011. But actually, this is a dry system, and it's more strongly affected by drought, which is a little more difficult to show in pictures. But we are also experiencing more and more extreme droughts in these systems. If we look at a global analysis of how climate will change, or will probably change on islands within the next century due to anthropogenic climate change, we see that for temperature, which is one part of climate, we see a general increase, which is of course clear. Our planet is warming, so will islands warm. Maybe not as strongly as the continent, because islands are buffered by the ocean in temperature. That's why they have a very equalized climate throughout the year, little seasonality. With precipitation, it's a little different. If we look at precipitation changes in the next decades, we see this diverging pattern. So an increase in variation in precipitation. And the general pattern is dry islands will become drier, and wet islands will become wetter. So the Canary Islands are actually a relatively dry island system, and it's predicted that they will become drier in the future. So this was a global perspective on climate change, but how will this actually affect species on the islands? And so to see how this will affect these species, for example, for my island, La Palma, where I work on, we did this species distribution modeling approach, where we modeled the distribution of all endemic plant species under current climatic conditions and under future climatic conditions. And then we kind of overlaid their distribution and made this map of change in species richness of endemic species. And the colors here indicate that where we have red colors or yellow colors, species richness will be lost under climate change, and the blue colors indicate species richness will increase under climate change. And what we already see is there's more red than blue, so species richness will in general decrease in many areas, especially in the coastal areas here, dry coastal areas, but also particularly in the Alpine system in the highest part of the mountain. So our Alpine species are particularly threatened here, and this makes sense because Alpine species, they already occupy the highest elevations of the island or a mountain peak. This is the same is true also for mountains. And when climate warms, they have to move upwards, but eventually there's no more room to move upwards because they're already at the peak, because species from lower elevations will push them over the top, which of course in this case might lead to extinctions. Of course, it's difficult to predict extinctions, or we can't predict extinctions, but what we find is 3 of the 5 what we call biggest losers are Alpine species. And we define biggest losers as species that lose 100% of their climatic suitable area. And this, of course, points in a very strong direction that these species will be threatened by extinction in the near future. But also the other question is, what will happen to the lowlands? We see that large areas will lose species in the lowlands, and they're already at the coast. So species can't come out of the ocean and move upwards. So the question is, where will these species come from? Will introduced species take over the functions, the ecological functions that the endemic species have? Because many endemic species have very important ecological functions for functioning of the ecosystems there. We really can't say. This is really a more like a philosophical question, and we'll have to see. Maybe there will be new techniques in the future how to estimate this. So far, we can't really say. Now, to look at mountain systems here, also the Alps are among them. This nice study in Nature from 2018 looked at different mountain systems in the Alps, from the Pyrenees to the Alps to the Scans to Svalbard Island, and it looked at how climate change has already affected mountains in the last 140 years or more. And how can they do that? They used, and this is a very nice approach, they used botanical studies that were 100 or 120, 140 years old, and went out there again and resurveyed same areas to see how species composition and species richness has changed over this long time period. But the question is, how do you find a vegetation survey area that was surveyed 120 years ago, when they didn't have any GPS or anything like that? And the brilliant idea was that these people already back then, they loved hiking. They loved hiking up mountain peaks and studying the flora on the mountain peaks. And these mountain peaks, of course, are still here. Nowadays, they haven't changed much. But so we can go back to these mountain peaks and survey the flora, and then compare the current survey with the past survey. And what we see in this little bit complicated map graph here is we see two things. The upper box always shows the temperature change in the time period, the study period, about 120 to 140 years. And the lower box always shows the change in species richness on these peaks. And what we see is two things. In general, we see there has been a dramatic increase of temperature in the last 120, 140 years, with a strong increase in the last 20 to 30 years. So there has been an acceleration in temperature change. And this pattern is very nicely mirrored in the changes in species richness. Species richness has increased and then dramatically accelerated in the last 20 to 30 years. So, and what does this mean for mountain peak species? And like we saw before, in high elevations, we find we have a high percentage of endemic species. And if species from the lowland are moving upwards into the areas where the endemic species usually occur, they will start to outcompete these high elevation specialists, and the low elevation or lower elevation generalists will replace them. So the mountain peaks might lose their uniqueness in the future, which is of course a dramatic loss for mountain biodiversity. Actually, when I was going through this paper, I realized that I was part of one of these resurvey efforts during my study program in 2009 in the Swiss National Park. I had a professor who had contacts there, and we went to hiked up several peaks there. I'm not in this picture now. I was taking this picture, but I was part of this resurvey effort, which is of course a collaborative effort of many hundreds of researchers. We did the same work as the guys back in the old days, but of course we weren't as stylish as they were. They look pretty cool. In general, what we see is that, and I'm sure you all know this, we're in the middle of this global biodiversity crisis. And what we have seen is that extinction rates have strongly increased, especially in the last 100 years, for all different kinds of taxonomic groups: amphibians, mammals, plants as well, which are not shown here. And extinction rates are much higher than the natural extinction rates would be. And the IPBES here has estimated, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has estimated that globally about 1 million species are threatened of extinction. And depending on how you count global species richness, because we don't know how many species really occur on Earth yet, that's about 5 to 10% of all species worldwide that are threatened now of immediate extinction. And of course, this is not fine. This is something that we are all working to stop. just to see what dramatic effects or what dramatic effects, large-scale effects anthropogenic biodiversity loss has. I'd like to show you this example of the bird fauna of New Zealand, where a colleague of mine studied how the European and pre-European colonization has led to widespread extinctions. The Maori already led several species like the moas to extinction, or the Haast eagle here, the largest eagle in the world. These species already went extinct pre-European colonization, and then when the Europeans colonized, many other species went extinct as well. And what my colleague did is he looked at the current species richness and the past species richness for the bird fauna, and then he let evolutionary models run and to see how long it would take for the current species richness to go back to its pre-human species richness. And what he finds is, and this is really astonishing, it would take 50 million years of evolutionary processes, natural evolutionary processes, to produce a comparable pre-human diversity in the bird fauna. 50 million years. If we go back 50 million years, we're almost back at the dinosaur age. And if we go 50 million years in the future, there won't be any Homo sapiens anymore. Homo sapiens, our species, is only 250,000 years old. So we have these irreversible effects on biodiversity that have already happened, and we're still losing biodiversity due to anthropogenic impacts. So we see very long-term impacts on diversity, which are basically for our species irreversible, because we won't be able to change these things. While, for example, climate change is something that we could change in a few generations. So I get to my last point because I'm running out of time a little bit. Island diversity is under threat. Even though islands only harbor about 20% of the species, 50% of the endangered species are island species because they are range restricted, because they are genetically impoverished. And 80% of the extinct species, for example, this dodo here, that we've already recorded are from islands. And 85% of these extinctions are linked to invasive species. So invasive species are very important for the loss of species on islands. For example, this is a very paradigmatic case. Lord Howe Island, which is a really small island, only 10 square kilometers, basically only are these two peaks here in the little lowland areas, accounts for more endemic species, endemic bird extinctions than Asia and Africa together. Altogether, there have been 11 extinctions on Lord Howe Island, documented extinctions. So we see here very much the different scale in terms of extinction. One important aspect are invasive species. For example, this species is very cuddly, cute European rabbit. My kids like to feed rabbits. But for island scientists, they're plant killers. They're one of the most dramatic plant killers on islands because the European rabbit is one of the 100 worst invasive species worldwide, especially on islands. And what we see is they preferentially browse endemic species, leading them to the extinction. This is generally a general process we see on islands because islands are isolated. We have few mammals there, very few herbivores. So plant species don't have to defend themselves with thorns, with chemical defenses like essential oils or alkaloids. And that now humans have brought mammals and herbivores there, and the endemic species taste much better, are much more palatable than other species. So they preferentially browse the endemic species. Just as a last quick example before I'm done, this is an example from La Palma, Genista beanohoavensis, an endemic shrub that we find in the Alpine system. Is a nice hemispherical shrub, can grow up to 3.5–4 meters high. But this is in an exclosure, so to keep the rabbits out. When the exclosure is broken down, this is another species, and rabbits and also goats can enter. The species is severely browsed and is fighting for its life, fighting for survival, and many just disappear then. Okay, to sum up the little take-home message here, I'd like just to say, or what we see is islands and mountains are surprisingly similar. I just like to throw in the term of sky islands again that we use often for mountains and the processes leading to biodiversity and endemism. Both islands and mountains are irreplaceable hotspots of global biodiversity. That's a very good reason to protect the biodiversity here and in mountains and on islands. But we also see that biodiversity, and I'm sure you also all know this for your mountain systems, is under pressure. And the main pressures are habitat destruction, climate change, invasive species, and overexploitation. This is what I know for islands, and I assume this is also true for mountain systems. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take some questions. Hope I didn't go over time too much.
Wow, ja, Severin, vielen Dank für die wirklich sehr interessanten Einblicke und auch für mich war es diese Parallelitäten zwischen Inseln und Berge, wobei ja also Inselsysteme und alpine Systeme, dass es da solche Parallelitäten gibt. Und es ist schon, wenn man dann mal wieder die Zahlen sieht, die ja wissenschaftlich erhoben sind, sind es schon dramatische Zahlen, die du uns da gezeigt hast. Und deswegen denke ich, ist es für uns alle auch eine gewisse Aufgabe, das auch nach außen zu tragen, diese Dramatik. Ich will jetzt aber gar nicht zu groß ausholen, weil wir haben nämlich jetzt Zeit für eine Fragerunde. Und da haben wir uns etwas überlegt. Dafür teile ich kurz meinen Bildschirm für alle Beteiligten, damit wir jetzt nicht nur im Chat schreiben und die Moderatorin und der Severin Irl spricht, haben wir uns Folgendes überlegt. Bitte jeder, der eine Frage hat, schreibt bitte in den Chat seinen Namen inklusive ein Kürzel, in welcher Sprache er oder sie diese Frage stellen möchte. Das kann man jetzt in sozusagen eine Muttersprache machen. Das Ganze wird dann auf Englisch übersetzt. Und Severin, du kannst dann darauf antworten. Und ganz wichtig, das würde uns freuen und bitte keine Scheu, Mikro einschalten, Kamera einschalten und bitte alle anderen auch wiederum, wenn es nicht schon getan worden ist, auf Speaker View stellen. Ich werde dann die Person auch nach oben anpinnen, also wir werden sie dann sehen. Und wir sind schon ganz gespannt auf die Fragen, die jetzt kommen. Marion.
Genau, wir haben schon erste Meldung.
Okay, Marion, ich pinne dich noch an. Okay. Marion, schieß los.
Ja, vielen Dank, Severin, für diesen Einblick und auch Ausblick. Meine Frage an dich wäre, was aus deiner persönlichen Perspektive, welche Maßnahme können wir oder sollten wir vor allem setzen, also auch vielleicht jede Einzelne, um es ist eine große Frage natürlich, um Klimawandel und vor allem auch dem Verlust der Biodiversität wirklich aktiv entgegenzuwirken. Wenn du spontan aus dem Bauch heraus antworten müsstest, würdest du sagen, okay, das wäre wichtig, wenn wir das jetzt sofort alle tun?
So yeah, that is a real big question, very difficult, I must say, because there's not the one thing we can change. There are many things we have to change. Yeah, and this is from our way we consume things, to the way we live, to the way we eat, to the way we travel. I guess. I mean, there are many different things here that sometimes even is contradictory. So in terms of climate change, it makes sense, for example, to plant forests. But in terms of biodiversity loss, we might be losing valuable grasslands, for example, that are very species rich, very important for pollinators, for example. So there's no one size fits all solution here. And I think we have to find individual local solutions. And I think that's, as I get, this is what you have been doing in this project here, to find local-based solutions that fit to the local context, because nature is very diverse, and there's always something that doesn't fit to the rule in nature, and so I think this is somewhat I guess I'm evading the answer a little bit here. We don't have this general framework that fits everybody or every place on Earth, but of course we all know in which direction we have to go, I guess, and this has been talked about now already for decades, that our use of fossil fuel consumption, our use of habitat, or the habitat destruction, overuse of exploitation of habitats, and these things like invasive species that are somewhat under the radar, they should maybe become more prominent. I guess also one important aspect is education, that these things are talked about, that people know about, that especially the next generation of younger people learn about this, and that they start living it, because young people are more impressionable, and it's more easier to change their habits than for older people, and that we educate people and society about these topics.
Okay, Marion, die Frage damit beantwortet. Ah ja, du hast auch schon Daumen hoch. Okay, dann habe ich eine Frage von Isabella. Isabella.
Genau, Entschuldigung, ich wechsle kurz den Hut, einfach weil ich es wirklich unglaublich interessant fand. Severin, als Optimistin interessieren mich ja auch diese hellblauen Bereiche. Was sind denn die neuen Species, die da in diesen mittleren Regionen auftauchen? Und hast du vielleicht eine Idee, was im alpinen Raum gegebenenfalls neue Arten sein könnten, die sich zeigen mit dem Klimawandel? Also wovon werden wir mehr haben und nicht nur weniger?
Okay, maybe I have to. You were talking about this. I'll go to the map. So I'll draw. I'll put the map up so everybody knows what we are talking about. So you're talking about this figure, I guess, right?
Ja, genau. Yes.
So the thing is, so what we did is we modeled the distribution of the current species that we have, the current endemic species, and their change in distribution area. So no new species will be occurring. Their distribution area will shift to new locations. And what we see here, that species from lower elevations will be shifting upwards into this mid-elevation area, and that at the top, species will be pushed over the top, kind of, and will likely or have a high probability of going extinct. And this is the case. Or I mean, of course, these are models, and models are always a simplified representation of reality. That's the definition of a model. So we're not 100% sure, of course, how what will happen in the future. And also climate change is something that is adaptive. We might react to climate change and might change the direction of climate change. So there's no 100% security that this will happen. This is just one scenario. That's why we use different scenarios, a good scenario, a bad scenario, or an intermediate scenario, to see how the possible outcomes might look like. And the same is true for the Alps. What we will likely see if temperatures increase, of course, is that species will move upwards, because following their temperature requirements, if the temperature isolines will be moving upwards, and also the species will be moving upwards. That means, especially for the alpine species above the tree lines will be moving upwards. So forested area will be moving upwards, and the habitat of alpine area, which is open, non-forested, will decrease. And just because smaller areas can just harbor fewer species, the likelihood is high that these species will go extinct. This is a general rule in ecology that larger areas can harbor more species and smaller areas can only harbor smaller amount of species. So just alone from the so-called species area relationship, we can deduce that there will be an extinction coming. We can't pinpoint which species will go extinct, but we can say a certain amount of species is very likely to go extinct.
Okay, vielen Dank.
So, wunderbar, vielen Dank, Severin. Wir hätten noch für eine Frage Zeit. Will jemand noch die Chance nutzen und Severin Irl etwas fragen bezüglich alpine Systeme, Inselsysteme, zum Thema Wildbienen? da schwitzt das Sevi dann. Ansonsten, Gregor Dietrich schreibt, in the Alps, bumblebees are big losers. Severin, hast du einen Kommentar dazu?
I've heard this before, yes, especially because of climate change and the possible homogenization of floras. So if we have diverse plant species with different kind of flowers and stuff like that, this will sustain a diverse bee or bumblebee community. If we only have very low diversity meadows, for example, which is the case when we have very high fertilizer input, for example, in valley systems in the mountains, which are highly fertilized, then we only where there's frequent mowing 3 or 4 or 5 times a year, then only a certain number of species are adapted to this high nutrient, high disturbance regime, and that always has a negative effect also on pollinator species. So the more diverse the plant community is, because I come from the plant side, the general rule is that the higher the pollinator community is as well.
Okay.
Maybe you've heard that before here. Not sure.
Okay, wunderbar. Vielen Dank, Severin. Wenn es jetzt keine Fragen mehr gibt, nein, ich schaue in den Chat, gibt es keine mehr, dann darf ich mich nochmal ganz herzlich bei dir bedanken, Sevi. Ja, viel Erfolg weiterhin bei deinen Forschungen und ich hoffe, du kommst bald mal wieder auf eine Insel. Hoffe ich auch, für mich persönlich. Und ja, nochmal danke, Severin. Und ja, wir werden uns sicherlich bald wiedersehen. Danke dir.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. And I hope all things go well in the future.
Danke, Severin.
Dankeschön.